Let me guess. You're trying to write a paper. You go on Google and search for conflict and democracy. And then you hope that ChatGPT is going to do the rest. That is not research. That is called procrastination dressed up as productivity. If you're interested in finding how to define your research question, how to find a topic, start here. Hello, everyone. My name is Bogdan Popescu, and I'm an assistant professor at John Cabot University, Rome. I also used to teach at Oxford and at Princeton. In today's video, I'm going to show you the difference between a research topic and a research question. I will give you strategies to come up with a research topic, but also how to hone your research question. Stick around and let's delve into it. Okay, the topic and research question, how to find it. So we're going to go first over how do you get from curiosity to defining a specific topic. What is the difference between a topic and a research question? We're going to go to finding and exploring the literature that's going to help us find a topic, but also a research question. We're going to look at how to craft a strong research question and then emphasize why this matters. So before we get into the topic itself, it's important to have a clean workspace. So when we write a paper, it's really important to have clearly defined folders. So you should have a folder that's called data, another folder that's called literature, another paper that's called paper, and another folder that's called paper, another folder that's called presentation, right? So this is really the essential logistical infrastructure in order to have an effective workspace. Okay, so it's important to distinguish between topic and question. So topic, as you might imagine, it's a broad area, it's a theme that you're interested in studying, whereas a research question is much more specific. It's something dedicated to what you're interested in investigating in particular. So I even drew an arrow that says exactly this, like the topic is much bigger. And then as you define your topic, you narrow it down to a research question. Okay, so a research topic comes from your curiosity. It's important to be curious about the topic that you're interested in, right? This could be events, issues, or processes around us. I mean, those are the kinds of things that stimulate our curiosity. Or it could be influenced by the theories and literatures that we have already read, right? So, in order to find a topic, you need to ask yourself, what is a big question that you've always wondered about? What's something that people argue about, but you'd like to understand better? So it's also important when you write a paper, it's important that you have a question and a topic that's relevant. So when I say relevant, that's typically defined by presence in the news. At the same time, another way to figure out what important topics are, you could also search for topics that have been published in leading journals in the last 2 years. So, for example, if you look at leading journals like the American Journal of Political Science, you see that some topics are more prevalent than others. So I've done a very quick research to examine the topics that have been pursued since January of 2024. So some of the common one have been dedicated to democratic backsliding and political legitimacy. So this is fundamentally about citizens acting as democratic safeguards or issues related to populism, legitimacy. But there's also been topics related to identity, ethnicity, and conflict, right? So how administrative units can shape ethnic identity, what are colonial legacies and how they impact ethnic party formation. Other kinds of topics are related to experimental methods and policy interventions, like how do citizens engage and how does that relate to public goods, gender quotas and electoral backlash. But there's also lots of topics focusing on the global south and post-colonial politics. So some topics related to this are the colonial origins of intergroup inequality or subnational politics in Africa, and so on and so forth. So these are four strands of topics that I identified starting all the way with January of 2024. But in terms of concrete advice, when you want to find a topic, it's really important to do some internal thinking. Are you excited to work on this topic? Are you excited to spend time writing and thinking about it? It's important to start broad, like big concepts, and sort of narrow it down as you read more and you do read more research. It's also important to avoid AI at this stage in the research process. Like it's really important to come up with your own research topic. It's important to find something that naturally motivates you. So some example here. So how to choose a topic. You can have this big topic, climate change. You could have something narrower like youth activism and climate change. And then you can end up with a question that's how TikTok is used to spread climate change awareness among teens. And this is kind of getting into question, but this is kind of something, a sort of trajectory from a topic to a question. So just to start finding a topic. So let's do this exercise. So spend the next 5 minutes coming up with a topic based on your specific curiosity. So this doesn't have to be the research question yet. So an example of this. Can one person really make a difference in the fight against climate change? So this is kind of something that you're curious about. This means that the big topic here is wildfires and collective action. Something obviously it could be wildfires, it could be tornadoes, it could be other kinds of extreme weather conditions. But this is how you can sort of connect a curiosity question to a topic. Another question and a topic could be my cousin, my relative drives an electric car. Does that help in the fight against climate change? So this means that the topic here is technology and climate change. Another question is, should plastic be banned? This is again something that you're curious about. The topic here would be policy effectiveness and climate change. Or do gender quotas produce backlash from men in parliaments? This means that you're interested in political representation and rhetoric. Okay, let's spend 5 minutes on this. Feel free to pause the video and spend five minutes thinking about what you're truly passionate about and come up with one or two keywords that reflect the topic that you're interested in. So feel free to pause the video and do that in the next 5 minutes. Okay, moving on to how to make the topic yours. So after you've done a list of questions that you're curious about, circle the 2 or 3 that are most interesting to you. So when you do that, spend the next 5 minutes writing 1 or 2 sentences for each of the following questions. So again, this is after you did those 5 minutes. This is another exercise in which you spend 5 minutes trying to explain why that question matters to you, what you think is true about that topic, and what is the aspect, what other aspect of the problem you'd like to learn more about, right? So feel free to pause the video and spend again 5 minutes on this. And maybe just before you do that, here's how you can do this. For example, let's imagine that I have this question and this topic. So do gender quotas produce backlash from men in parliaments? So this means that I'm interested in political representation rhetoric. So the first question is like, why does this matter to me? So for example, an example of an answer to this question is because it reveals how efforts to improve representation can unintentionally provoke resistance from those who feel their power is threatened. Understanding the backlash helps explain why progress on gender equality is often uneven or fragile. The next question, what do you think is true about this? I think it's true because it's true that some men respond defensively to gender quotas, not just out of self-interest, but also because they view them as unfair or symbolic rather than merit-based. And finally, what aspect of the problem you would like to know more about? You can say something like, I would like to understand how backlash manifests, whether it affects legislative behavior, cooperation, public rhetoric, and whether it can be mitigated through institutional design or framing strategies. So this is the kind of answers I would like to see, or I would like you to spend time coming up with. So feel free to pause this section in order to justify or in order to make the topic yours. Okay, so it's also important to note that as you progress in your research, your topic will likely slightly change, and this is because it comes come come. This is because you do more research, you refine your question, you maybe read more literature, so you could narrow down your research topic in a direction that's slightly different from the one that you started off from. So it's also important to note that when you write research, you're also joining an intellectual conversation. So this is sort of metaphorical because you're not really having a conversation, but you're becoming familiar with the literature and you're also engaging in a dialogue, metaphorical dialogue with it. We will discuss much more on this one in the literature review video that I'll be making later. So, we're still in the part about finding a topic. So how to join this intellectual conversation. So it's important to make a list of articles that are very close to this topic that you defined for yourself and that you explain that is important for you. So once you do that, it's important to find out what other people say about this topic and how they approached it. So how do you do this in practice? You go to Google Scholar, right? So you type in Google and you type in Google Scholar. And within Google Scholar, you search for 3 articles that are directly related to your topic. So what do you need to type in? So you should type in the 2 factors, the 2 concepts that you're really interested in. So for example, you might search for youth activism and climate change, citizen participation, democratic backsliding, colonial legacies and quality bureaucracy, gender quotas and political rhetoric. So notice that these are sort of 2 concepts linked by one conjunction, the and. Okay, so let's imagine I'm interested in gender quotas and political rhetoric. So when you search for Google Scholar, this is what you should see. So you type in the search box gender quotas and political rhetoric, or the concept that you wanted to find more about. So this is what shows up when I type in gender quotas and political rhetoric. So in order to choose what sources you should be looking at, it's important to choose based on 3 important criteria. Those are relevance. So how close is this to what you're really interested in, right? So is this what you had in mind when you typed in gender quotas and political rhetoric? That's probably the most important criterion. Number 2, citations. It's important to look at articles that are widely cited, especially in the early stages. You want to understand who the most important scholars in this field or who have written on this topic are. And then you definitely want to focus more on peer reviewed publications. This means that these are academic articles that have been peer reviewed. So you shouldn't spend or you shouldn't look too much at reports, or you definitely not news articles, but much more on, you should look at peer reviewed journals, ideally high ranking journals, because those are the kinds of outlets are most likely to produce research that's at the highest level. Okay, once you find those 3 sources, 3 articles, you should save them in your literature folder. So let's say, for example, so it's also important to save those articles in this type of form. So this is important because this is going to make your life much easier once you have more than 5, more than 10 articles that you want to cite, right? So you soon realize that you read an article, you find it interesting, 2 weeks go by, and then you remember like, oh, what was that article saying? I think there was something interesting or important there, but what was it called? So without labeling the article appropriately, you will have a really hard time going back to it. Okay, so let's imagine that I have this article, I saved it under my literature folder. I guess one question that you may have here is what happens if the documents in Google Scholar are irrelevant, or what happens if they're inaccessible, meaning that you click on the PDF, but somehow the website is asking for a subscription. If you don't find the sources, you have to keep looking. It's exactly like Google. You go to page one, page two, page three, until you find the articles that are most relevant, that you have access to, and that have a large number of citations. So keep looking at Google Scholar and search based on relevance, number of citations, and the source type until you find those three documents. Okay, so let's imagine you've done this. Let's imagine you've done those three documents. You have to spend some time now trying to go over the abstracts, right? So the abstracts are the kind of summaries that each peer-reviewed article has at the beginning of the article itself. So let us spend 5 minutes and go through the three abstracts. So in those 5 minutes, I would like you to highlight the verbs and the key phrases that indicate what the authors are asserting or what they're stating. So if this is not close to what you had in mind when you searched for them in the first place, then they're not probably worth keeping. It's probably worth deleting them and searching for new articles. So let's take my examples. So this is, for example, an article, Quotas for Men. So this is what I did in the um, for this exercise, right? So gender quotas traditionally focus on the underrepresentation of women. Conceiving of quotas in this way perpetuates the status of men as the norm and women as the other. Women are subject to heavy scrutiny of their qualifications and competence, whereas men's credentials go unchallenged. This article calls for a normative shift in the problem of overrepresentation, arguing that the quality of representation is negatively affected by having too large a group drawn from too narrow a talent pool. Curbing overrepresentation through seeding quotas for men offers three core benefits. First, it promotes democracy by ensuring the proper scrutiny of politicians by both sexes. Second, it provides an impetus for improving the criteria used to select and evaluate politicians. Third, neutralizing the over masculinized environment within parliaments might facilitate better substantive and symbolic representation of both men and women. All citizens would benefit from these measures to increase the quality of representation. So I highlighted in yellow the verbs that the author is using in order to make their claim. So these are examples. This is an example of what I would like you to do with the three articles. So I'd like you to spend 5 minutes on it. So feel free to pause the video until you do the exercise. Okay. So another homework, another thing to do here after you've highlighted the verbs that the author are using is to start a conversation, right? So spend the next 10 minutes writing 2 or 3 sentences in response to these questions. So, 1, do you agree or disagree with the main conclusion? Why? What questions do you still have after reading the abstract? What do you want to say to them, meaning to the authors, and why it is important to say that? Why does this topic chosen matter to you? So those are the 4 questions. So here's how I thought about this. So do you agree or disagree with the main conclusion? Why? So this is the same abstract. So my response to this, yes, I agree. Reframing quotas to address men's overrepresentation challenges the assumption that men are the default and promotes a more balanced standard for evaluating all candidates. It is a provocative but necessary shift to make meritocracy truly inclusive. So I agree with the message in the abstract. Second question is, what questions do you still have after reading the abstract? So I still have 2 questions like this. How would seeding quotas for men be implemented without backlash or unintended consequences? Is there any empirical evidence that overrepresentation leads to lower quality politicians, right? So this is never clear from the abstract. So those are the kinds of questions that I had when I read it. Of course, you'd have somebody else may have different kinds of questions. Question number 3: what do you want to say to the author, and why is it important to say that? So if I were to speak to the author, I would say something that like this. So great that the authors are trying to flip the script. By naming overrepresentation, they expose a power structure that is rarely questioned. So it's important because it forces us to rethink fairness and not just as inclusion, but also as limitation. So those are the 3 questions that I would like you to think about. And then the final 4th question is, why does this topic matter to you? So here's an example of an answer to this question. It matters because it challenges how we define excellence and fairness in politics. The idea that merit is already gendered makes me rethink the legitimacy of who holds power and who is excluded. So spend the next 10 minutes trying to answer these 4 questions for all the 3 articles that you identified. So feel free to pause the video. Okay, what have we done so far? So when it comes to finding the topic, we have chosen a topic. We clarified why it matters. We found 3 related articles, and then we reflected on the existing articles. So we're now ready to move on to the research question. Okay, a research question is something that's more narrow than a topic. I hope this is already clear by now. But a research question also has to be important. It should not have been answered before, and it has to be researchable. Those are the 3 important criteria that important research questions or research questions have to take. So it has to be important, it shouldn't have answered before, and it should be researchable. So when I mean researchable, this means that you have to ask yourself, can you access people, statistics, or documents from where you could collect data? Can this data be accessed within the limited amount of time that you have in order to write the paper? How long would you need to complete the research necessary in order to answer the question? So here's some examples of research questions. So is the US winning its war on terror? So this is a general question. It's an important question. But the problem with this question is that it's too broad to be researched. We do not know what war on terror is and what does it count as winning. A better version of this would be something like, what has been the impact of securitization of Muslim charities in Egypt since 9/11? You clearly see the difference. So you're much clearer about the outcome of interest. You're much clearer about what winning means. And on average, you're much clearer about what you're interested in researching. It still is important, but it's much more specific. Here's another example. Does globalization undermine the basis of the nation state? So again, this is an important question, but it's too broad to be researched. A better formulation of this question is, what impact does economic integration have on state autonomy? Do high levels of integration into the world economy decrease a state's ability to manage its public finances? So notice how you're still addressing an important question, but you're much more specific about the outcome that you're trying to measure. Other bad questions. So how did the Cold War end? This is a bad question because it's overly descriptive, right? It's literally explain what happened after the Cold War. And there's no exploratory angle. There's nothing to explore. A second bad question. Does politics affect the economy? It's just way too general. It's way too vague. What does the economy, what does politics mean? Or you could also come up with saying that's a bad question because the answer is yes. Yeah, politics impacts the economy and probably also economy impacts politics. A third bad question would be, will there be peace in the Middle East? So this is a bad question because it's too speculative, and there's no theoretical framing. Good questions would sound like this. What factors act as stimulus or facilitator to terrorism? Why do some post-authoritarian states succeed in building independent judiciaries while others do not? Why do civil conflicts reignite after peace agreements in some cases, but not others? So, do you see the difference between bad questions and good questions? You see that these are much more narrow and much more focused. Okay, so what makes them good questions? So, first of all, they identify a clear outcome. So, in one case, you have judicial independence. In the second case, you have civil conflict. In the third case, you have terrorism. The second reason why these are good questions is that they imply a causal mechanism, or they motivate an exploration of causal mechanisms. So they're asking why variation exists across cases, inviting you to develop a theory. The third reason why these are good questions is that they are researchable, right? So you can define measurable variables, you can collect data, and then you can test a theory. So this is why these are good questions. Okay, there's a second category of questions that I would call okay-ish. So, depending on who you're asking, some of these questions are good and some are not that great. I call them okay-ish. So here's my categorization of those. So, okay-ish question could be predictive. So here's an example. Will the spread of disinformation undermine electoral legitimacy in emerging democracies? Can declining trust in traditional media predict support for populist parties? Here's examples of descriptive questions. What are the consequences of AI in politics? How will different audiences react to terrorism? What type of individual becomes a terrorist? Some prescriptive questions. Can political violence be justified? How can governments respond to terrorism? So these are three categories of what I call okayish questions. Okay, so why are they okay and not good? Here's why. So predictive questions may lack causal theory. Just because you're good at forecasting outcomes doesn't mean you're good at explaining outcomes. So I hope you guys see the difference between forecasting and explaining. Descriptive questions also lack a causal argument, or they lack a theory. So descriptive entails more describing a pattern, right? So writing about a pattern, but without explaining why you see that pattern. Finally, prescriptive questions are normative, but not empirical. So this means that they cannot be tested empirically, right? So again, these doesn't mean that some scholars may regard them still as good questions, but the problem here is that you have to put more work in order to convince the reader that these are good research questions. Okay, so let us do some more work here. So let's spend 5 minutes coming up with 3 research questions based on the topic that you identified. So remember that we spend extensive amount of time on the topic. So here are examples of 3 research questions based on the research topic. So here's the ones I identified. How do gender quotas affect the tone of parliamentary rhetoric by male politicians? Do gender quotas lead to shifts in how male politicians frame issues related to gender and representation? Do gender quotas increase the use of gendered or exclusionary language and legislative debates? Those are 3 questions that are still about gender quotas and political representation, but they're much more specific. So you should also spend 5 minutes on this, trying to come up with 3 research questions. The reason I say three is because this is going to allow you to focus on one after you came up with three. So spend 5 minutes on this. Feel free to pause the video and come up with a research question. Okay. After doing this, you have to think about rationale. So what does this mean? You have to reflect on why this question is interesting, right? So this is a combination of why it's interesting for you, but more importantly, why is it interesting for someone who reads the article? This is also similar to why this question is important and why it doesn't matter. So this is going to help you hook the reader, get the reader's attention. So here too, let us spend some time trying to write a sentence that starts like this. This finding is important because. So some of the reasons why, or some of the things that you could write here in your article, could be things related to the fact that you substantiate a theory that exists in your field, meaning you provide empirical evidence. You take a side of the debate in your field, so there might be contradictory positions related to a specific question. So you help answer, or you try to side with one side of the debate by providing empirical evidence. You could also say that your findings contradict conventional wisdom, meaning most people thought about this topic this way. In this work, I'm actually showing the opposite. You could also say that both sides of a debate are wrong, and then you're showing the third possibility. And then you could also provide an answer to an enduring question in your field that nobody has answered before. So these are 5 different ways to articulate the importance of your field or your question in a way that's distinct from why it's important to you. So here are examples of why is your question interesting, without clearly stating that my question is interesting because. So going back to the gender quotas example, so gender quotas are designed to change who gets a seat at the table, but they may also reshape how power is expressed once everyone is seated. So there's 2 components to the explanation, right? So this is about allocation of power, who gets to sit at the table where decisions are made, but also how power is being expressed. So exploring how male politicians adjust their rhetorical style in response offers a lens into the subtle, often hidden dynamics of resistance and adaptation within political institutions. Okay, and an example of an answer to the question of why this is important. So it can reveal how institutional reforms can shape not just who participates in politics, but also how they engage with each other in a rhetorical manner. Spend 5 minutes trying to answer these 2 questions based on one of the 3 questions that you select. Okay. It's also important when it comes to research questions to emphasize the gap. This is something that we're going to discuss more in the literature review. So I'll do a separate video on the literature review. It's also potentially possible that the research question will be revamped, rewritten once you're more familiar with the literature and once you identify the gap. It's important to think about what the gap in the literature could be because the transition or the flow between the research question and the literature review will become much more obvious. This is just a short sort of comment on the gaps, and this is something that we'll have to think about as we progress in writing the article. And then finally, you also should think about feasibility, like how feasible is your question? So when we say feasibility, we have to ask ourselves, can we find data on the topic, on the question that we're interested in answering? Can we do this within the allocated time? Will I need access to fieldwork or other responders that may be hard to reach? So these are important questions that you have to think about when you're writing your research questions. So some caveats or some pitfalls that are important to mention. So you might find a topic that's too recent, that doesn't have enough literature written on, You might try to solve some issue, meaning you might try to say that something is right or something is wrong, but you don't have empirical tools. Or you may choose a topic that's too cool, but it's not really feasible. So these are three things that you should keep in mind when you come up with a research question. Okay, we have covered quite some ground today. So we covered how to come up with a topic and how to come up with a research question. I hope that now there is a clear distinction between the two. So finding a research question is typically harder than finding a topic. So a topic is just more generic than a research question. The research question will also change slightly as you become more familiar with the literature. And it's also important to note that as you go through the different research steps, your topic and your research question will change slightly. Okay, so just to reiterate, that these are the kinds of assignments that I gave in this presentation. So the first one had to do with searching for the related literature, using Google Scholar to find free sources that are very closely connected to your topic. So this is going to help hone the topic that you're interested in. I also emphasized that it's important to save the articles that you find in a very specific format that's going to allow you to track those articles after you're done researching. You have to, I asked you to highlight some key ideas based on the abstracts, and then to emphasize whether you agree or disagree with the main conclusion of the article. What questions do you still have? What do you want to say to the authors of the article? And why does the topic chosen matter to you? And then, based on the topic that you've chosen, you need to write three research questions. And here I emphasize that they have to be specific. Ideally, they should be causal and then researchable. And finally, the sixth assignment that I asked you to do is to think about the rationale for your research question. So, why is your question interesting? Without explicitly saying that my question is interesting because, and then why is it important? Why does it matter? I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you now know the difference between a research question and a research topic. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Also, if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the comment sections. Thank you and see you very soon.